Hi, I'm Bill. Welcome back to the workshop. Here's something different for today. This is a Rinnai 60-9514 3-burner camp stove. You've probably never seen one like this. It's fired up here. I've got it going. Let's take a quick look around it. It's got this top plate with the burners below. The color scheme on this particular model is very similar to Coleman. So you've got knobs on the side there to control the auxiliary burners. The generator goes across the center burner, the primary. And we've got our tank here. In many respects, this is very, very similar to a Coleman Explorer, a Model 5A or 5B from the early to mid-60s. But it's not. It's made by Rinnai in Japan. So, let me shut this off. We'll pull the other two out, and let's talk about Rinnai. All right, so I'm back, and I've got two of the 2-burner Rinnai stoves with me. This on the left is an Eaton's RX100R. They're pretty common around here. Eaton sold a lot of these. It's a 2-burner. There's a 3-burner that's virtually identical. It's just stretched with an extra burner on it. And then here we have a Rinnai 60-9511 stove. It's the double version burner of the 3-burner that I had lit at the beginning of the video. They are, again, exactly the same, except for the number of burners. The other one's just extended. This is not so common. We don't know a lot about the Rinnai stoves. We know something about the company today. They're best known, at least here in North America, for their tankless water heater systems. But the company was started in 1918 in Nagoya, Japan, by a couple of guys, Kanekichi Hayashi and Hidejiro Nato. Hayashi was intrigued by an imported oil burning stove that he came across, and he ended up leaving the Nagoya Gas Company and started his own company making gas appliances, originally most of them running on gasoline. Later they branched out into other types of appliances, and I believe at present they're the largest manufacturer of gas kitchen appliances in Japan. But back in the 60s and 70s, one of the products they made was camp stoves. I don't know how many they sold in Japan, but they certainly sold a fair number over here. This model that was made for Eaton's was also badged for other manufacturers. As far as I know, the Eaton's versions all have this embossed gold lettering on the front. The ones they made for other companies, notably Montgomery Ward in the US, and I've been told Western Auto, didn't have as elaborate branding. They had decals or stickers on them, and the color schemes were different. This gold and this light green was unique to the Eaton's branded stoves. They're relatively common. This is quite uncommon. The 2-burner I came across this last summer locally came from a guy who'd only had it for a week, so I don't know what its provenance is. He bought it from a storage unit. The 3-burner showed up 5 days later. A collector friend of mine down island found it for me, which was bizarre because while I know of one other of these here on the island, there's nothing on the internet. They used this model number, the 60-9511, as well as the model number for the 3-burner on the versions they made for Montgomery Ward, for example. But these unbadged green and red stoves seem to be nearly unicorns. I don't know who sold them, probably not Eaton's, but they may have been sold through independent retailers looking to sell a stove, but not authorized to sell a Coleman stove, perhaps. So, what can I say about them? Obviously, they're very similar to Coleman stoves. I think the build quality is, in most respects, superior. The Eaton stove is the later one from the 70s, and the ones like it that would have been badged for Montgomery Ward and others have a few features that are simplified, mainly the pump. This has a pump that simply screws it threads into the check valve. We'll take a look at that later. I'll pull the pump out so I can show it to you. These older ones, this is the one clumsy engineering aspect on these. I don't know why they did it, but you can see that the pump handle here is separated, and in order to screw it in, I'm unscrewing it so I can pump it. So now I can pump it up, but when you go to screw it in, it won't thread. This stop keeps it from threading in. I don't know what the point of that is, but you have to separate these two by pulling out the center part and then pushing it in and turning it. And of course, the first time, it never catches, so you have to hold it a couple of times. It helps if you've got the tank off the stove too. But they ditched this design for this simpler design later on, which I think was a good thing. But other than that, the build quality, the cases are sturdy. The top plate here is a nice feature. These pot stands simply, they drop down for storage, otherwise the lid won't close properly. Great stoves. I've got the instructions here for the Eaton's model and also the parts list. And they are interesting, however, because they've both got a little knob on the side, and if you pull it, it opens a baffle, or I believe it calls it, in the parts it calls it a damper. In the instructions it calls it, where did I see that? An air shutter. When it's closed, it's got a small hole in the center. When you pull it open, that hole is pulled off to the side, and it basically opens almost all of the bottom of the manifold to air. In theory, that's supposed to help when it's lighting, so you've got more air for burning. This has the same thing, although you can't see it because it's underneath this top plate. Oddly enough, a 3-burner, I'll show you later, the 3-burner doesn't have that. It's the manifold simply open on the bottom. This controls the fuel and air mixture, which really is unnecessary because while it's not documented in here, in fact in the instructions it says to open the fuel knob a couple of turns when you go to light it. When you take this apart, and I'll show you, you actually see it has the equivalent of Coleman's instant light circuit, whereas the Coleman stoves have the little flip-up lever on the side. You turn that up and it pushes the air wire down to limit the flow of fuel so the stove doesn't flood. This is like the Coleman lanterns. It's got the same air wire in there. It's got a fuel and air tube virtually identical to a Coleman with a spring-loaded air wire, and it's held in place until you open the knob more than about half a turn, and then the spring causes it to lift up and you get unrestricted fuel flow. So it's not noted in here, but if you open these up a quarter, maybe at most half a turn, it has an instant light circuit. Of course, that's Coleman's patent, but you can use that to light it rather than messing with the air shutter or the damper back there. Once they're running, that really doesn't seem to make any difference. Let's take an overview, a flyby, if you will, of the earlier Rinnai model. We zoom in here, you see the top is covered with a plate. It appears to be nickel-plated steel. The pot stands as well are nickel-plated steel. You can see those look like they've got these pins here that orient them, and they go into these holes. For storage, of course, this is too tall for the lid to close, so they simply turn and fit down like that. Now, I'd pull this out right now, but I can't because you can see the generator locks this top plate in place. So we'll look underneath when we get to the newer model, the Eatons. They're essentially identical underneath. The windscreens are held in place with the wavy wires, kind of like the American Coleman models and some of the early Canadians. On this side over here, we've got the auxiliary burner control. It's got a, I don't know if it's plastic or Bakelite handle on it. And if we move around to the other side, You can see this is the damper control, and it just pulls out and pushes back in. Here's the Eaton's, the later version from the 70s. You can see the gold embossed badge on the front. Everything about this otherwise is the same legs. In fact, you can see this has the same problem with the rubber stops. The right one is missing. When we open up the stove, one thing we can see, the tank stores inside the stove body itself, the same way the Colemans do. The difference is you can see that clip. All three of these stoves have that. There's a clip that holds the tank in place so that it doesn't kick around inside. It does mean the tank usually gets worn or scratched where that clip holds it, but it doesn't otherwise get banged around. Here we are with the tank mounted on the stove. You can see underneath, you probably saw a glimpse of it earlier, there's a wrench that snaps underneath the tank clip, and that's got slots on it for everything on this stove that'll take a wrench. See the tank on the front there. And like the earlier model, we've got the damper control on the right. And we've got the auxiliary burner control on the left. So anyhow, that's the Rinnai stoves, and I'm going to set these aside and come back in a minute, and we'll have one of the tanks disassembled so I can show you some of the differences and similarities between these and Coleman's and how they work, and then later we'll fire up one of these, the Eaton, so you can see how it goes. Okay, here's the valve, exploded view. I've pulled it from the tank, I've taken it apart so you can see how everything lines up here, sort of how it goes together. If you're familiar with a Coleman valve, you'll see some things that look familiar, some things that look just a little bit different, a few things that are significantly different, although functionally this valve, like I said, is basically the same as a valve on a Coleman stove. Like I also said, I think the build quality on these Rinnai stoves is somewhat better than the Coleman's, at least in the same two-burner tourist type stove, 421, 4M, 431, 425 category. So the first thing you'll notice, or that I'll point out here, is you've got a fuel and air tube. It looks very much like a fuel and air tube from a Coleman stove. Orifice is about the same size. If you look on here, you might be able to just barely see, there's the air hole. The air wire, very similar as well, got a little spring on there. The one difference is it's not uniform in length. This is a little thicker, it's sturdier, but this is probably, I think if you held this up to a Coleman air wire, the tip would be about the same. Like we saw earlier, before I took the valve out, or took it apart, you can see it still it has this instant light feature. You can see that poking, the air wire poking through. So even though, oddly enough, they don't mention this in the lighting instructions for the Eaton stove. The Eaton stove valve is the same. All the valves on all of these are identical. If you open the valve roughly a quarter to a half turn, it will leave that air wire blocking the hole so it won't flood. When you turn the knob out all the way, then it releases this and the plunger, and the air wire retracts, and you get an unrestricted flow of fuel. So I honestly don't know what Rinnai was doing with those dampers on the bottom of the manifold for lighting, because it just doesn't seem necessary. It's got what amounts to an instant light circuit. The only difference from a Coleman stove is that the Colemans have the little lighting lever you have to flip up and down, whereas this works like a Coleman lantern where it's managed by the main knob. So we've got our main valve body. There's a lock nut that goes on here, and that locks it down to the fount. Our fuel and air tube connects on there. Now, one thing that is different, or a little bit different, you see this little pile of stuff here. These are the packing, graphite packings. On the Rinnais, they seem to have, it's listed as one part in the parts list, but it's not a single cylinder or a cohesive cylinder like you see on the Colemans. It's a bunch of smaller rings, and they tend to fall apart when you take them off. So there's a stop ring that goes on here that sits just above the threads, and then we put our graphite packing on, and these just all go on. Doesn't really matter how they go on. They'll all squish together as necessary when we put it back in the valve. There's a larger stop ring that goes on the outside, and then this will go in the valve, and I will probably have to cut this and put it in my vise in order to get all that graphite in there. We'll have to knock that in. So I'm going to cut that, and I'll be right back once I've got that packing squashed back in there. Okay, that's done. As you can see, the packing is in there. The easiest way to do that is just because it won't go in easily, so you can put the nut backwards on that and put it in the vise and gradually, carefully squeeze it in. So you can see the packing, it's kind of squeezing or oozing out there. It's in just enough that we can thread the nut on. But before we put the nut on, like we would on a Coleman, this has a lock nut that needs to go on here first. Thread it on there. Should not be that. There we go. Now we put the valve nut on. These don't turn very far. And we'll pull that lock nut back. Now the knob, you can see it's got our little direction on and off in there. It even says Rinnai across the top. That's good. All right. So here's where they also differ from Coleman. You'll see there's this, I don't know what to call it other than a brass washer. It's rather thick, and it seems unnecessary. They could have used a larger screw, but and a smaller hole. But we'll put that washer in there, and then we've got this tiny little lock washer which goes on the brass screw. Again, like I said, these and we'll just screw that in. That's our valve assembly. The generator now screws on the back of here, and again, this very much like a Coleman generator. You can see hopefully the threads on here. It threads into the back end of the valve stem just like on a Coleman. It's got a spring inside there, just like on a Coleman stove. It's got the gas tip, made of brass, just like on a Coleman. So, very, very similar. Of course, it's all based on the same theory of operation. The one difference with the Rinnai is you've got this hex fitting on the back end of the generator, which is much nicer than the Coleman's because you can put a wrench on that. Instead of with the Coleman's, you've got to tighten it from the gas tip end or put pliers on the round surface and try to tighten it. So that's our valve. Again, you can see well, actually it's hard to see here with the valve closed, but the air wire is there blocking the orifice, and then as we open the valve, it retracts and we can see that the hole is completely open. So so that's our Rinnai valve, and we'll go over to the pump assembly, I think. Okay, now here we are with the pump assembly and check valve extracted from the fount. So you can see this. Again, it's a nice design for the most part. I think the build quality is actually superior to Coleman's. It's more durable, it's easier to work on. The one quirky thing, as I pointed out before, and the later stoves got rid of this. You simply screw the pump handle down to lock or to seal the check valve. That's this. The later ones, you simply screw it down. For whatever reason, these earlier ones, you have to separate these two, which basically means pulling out this outer part, and then you push it in and lock it down. But it's a pain to push it in while holding this out. So I really don't know what was going on, what the engineering is with that. But again, nice design. As you can see, that where Coleman, the pump cap, either the older ones have the two little tiny screws to fumble with, or the later ones have the spring clip. This is a really nice, I'm sure it's way more expensive, it's a nice solid piece of brass, and it simply goes on and, oops, get it lined up properly. Whoops. There we go. It simply threads onto the tank. Much nicer design, in my opinion, much easier to work with. But like a Coleman, we've got our pump cap, got a spring. Oops, these are out of order, but we've got a washer here that backs the pump leather. One thing you'll see with the pump leather on this, there's a copper or brass spring inside, which helps the pump cup keep its shape and makes it a bit more durable. So that's I think a really nice feature. That goes on, this little cylinder fits over that to keep the pump cup centered properly. And then instead of that flat square washer thing that the older Colemans used, this actually just has a nice nut. You could easily put this on with a socket, or it's much easier to grab. I just grab it with the pliers here, and I can turn, and that's nice and tight. Now, I pulled the check valve out. Again, this is a really nice design too. Notice it's just got a big slot in there. No special check valve tool required on these Rinnai stoves. All you need is a big flathead screwdriver. It fits into that slot. Make sure you've got a good grip on the tank, because they put some pretty strong thread locker on here, and the whole thing just turns off or turns out. This is a different design than the Colemans, which have that little ball bearing, and the back pressure that's in the fount causes the ball bearing to seat and seal the check valve. This, you'll see it's slotted on the bottom, and I've already loosened this, so it should come off easily enough. This has a spring and a spring-loaded pip inside. So we'll take off this back end, and here's our spring and our pip, and it's just got a piece of rubber on the top here. Again, the really nice thing with this design, if this rubber dries out, if it no longer seals, pull that off, cut a new piece of rubber, put it on. It probably, in this case, doesn't even need to be Viton or fuel resistant because it's just down here in the check valve. It's not going to be exposed to fuel. Yeah, it's a very elegant, very nice design. The one different thing is because it's a spring-loaded pip, the feeling when you pump this up is going to be very different because you're not pumping air in all the way down the stroke. You pump this in and you build up pressure, and then when the pressure reaches, when the pressure becomes strong enough, that spring is compressed and the air goes past the pip. So it's sort of like, and then pop, pop. So it is kind of a funny thing in that way. But it works well. I think that's why in the instructions they don't say, like Coleman does, put in 30 or 40 strokes. It just says to pump it up until it builds up pressure and becomes difficult to pump because it works a different way. But while we've got the tank, the one other thing I want to show you on here that's different is the fuel cap. I mean, the first thing you'll notice is it's much larger. These are aluminum, much larger, which unfortunately means you're out of luck if the fuel cap gasket is bad. If you've got an AGM stove or lantern or something, you can use a Coleman fuel cap gasket in it. These obviously are too big for that. The good news is, so far, every one of these I found that was dried out or that didn't seal, the rubber is very thick and they're fairly easy to peel out. You can use a little flathead screwdriver and pop part of it out and then grab it with needle nose pliers, and usually the whole thing just pulls right out. And then flip it over and put it back down, press it into place, and you'll be good to go. The cap gaskets are really nice in that regard. If you've got the equipment to do it, you could buy some Viton and cut your own fuel cap gasket. If you're really in a pinch, O-rings aren't the greatest thing because sometimes they don't always seal quite right. But it's that fits on there right, and it fits down in the fuel cap. This is a number 18, 018. Number 18 O-ring is the size you want for one of these. And finally, you might be able to see it on the camera, I'm not sure, but this is a really nice feature. It's a brass screen to filter your fuel. You don't have to mess with a filter funnel if you don't have one or don't want to. But let's see, this has caught a little bit of crud and kept it out of the fount. The Eaton stove have this. It seems to be a common thing with the Rinnai. So again, that's just a really nice feature. Like I said, I think the build quality on these is really superb. So that's the tank, and that's all the details for the valve and the pump. And I'm going to put this back together, and I'll see you in a bit. Now we're ready to fire up the stove, and I'm going to use the Eaton stove because it's got the open grate so you can actually see what's going on. The stoves are virtually identical. The main difference with these later Rinnai stoves is these burners, the burner caps are basically the same as Coleman's, with that, Coleman called it band of blue with the alternating flat and corrugated rings under there. On the older ones, the burner base is the same, but they have these caps that go on there. They remind me of some of the more recent propane stoves, and they seem to function just as well. I really don't see that it makes any difference. That's the only difference in the burners, really. You can see, I think, in the instructions here, I've got the instructions that came with the Eaton stove, and it refers to this here. You can see I can slide it in and out. It refers to that as the air shutter. In the parts diagram, it refers to it as the damper, which makes more sense. Like I said, I'm not really sure why they put that on there. We're going to follow the instructions as they say, and I'm going to open it up. And maybe you can see if I move this over and I take the grate off, you can see there's a little circular hole in the bottom. So what ends up happening is when this is closed, that little circular hole is right underneath the manifold there. So that's the air intake. When we open it like this, that hole basically is blocked, but it opens up half of the underside of the manifold. So we go from having just this little hole to having the manifold essentially just exposed to the open air. So to light it, we'll go ahead and leave that open like they say. It's basically got the equivalent of Coleman's instant light circuit, so it really shouldn't make a difference, but we'll do what it says. With regard to that, what's interesting here, I took the burner assembly out of the 3-burner older Rinnai. The older Rinnai, the 2-burner is just like this. For whatever reason, the 3-burner, you can see it's just open underneath the manifold there. In fact, it's set up. They could have put a damper or an air shutter on here, but they didn't. All this needs to do, this little piece needs to be folded over. Actually, you'd need one on the back too. So if you don't need it on the 3-burner, I don't know why you need it on the 2-burner. Obviously, on the 3-burner, it probably would have been difficult to place a handle for it. It would probably have to come out the back, and that would be really awkward, and you'd have people reaching over there, bending over their stove to do that and probably setting themselves on fire or something. So I don't know. I've got gas in here. Valve is shut off. This newer style pump, everything's the same except that I'm not really sure other than what this part's for, other than maybe it makes it easier to hold when you're pumping it like this. Screw a little more. There we go. And we'll pump it up. You kind of hear it hit smack, smack, smack. That's because it's building up pressure, and then when the pressure, especially when you're pumping fast, when the pressure gets strong enough, it opens that spring and the air goes into the fountain, or goes into the tank. Okay, I think that's probably going to be enough. Lock that back down. And we're ready to light. So, light a match. Open about a there it goes. That was certainly easy to light. Of course, it's very much like a Coleman, so it's going to take about 30 seconds to a minute to heat up the generator, and then once that's heated up, should be good to go with the 2nd burner. This is open only a 1/4 of a turn. Opening it wider. So that looks pretty good. So we'll pull out the auxiliary knob. And there we go. Let me turn the light out so you can see that blue. All right, there you go. It's an Eaton's RX100R made by Rinnai, burning away. There are other variations on this stove, like I said. You may find one branded for Montgomery Ward. I think I've heard they were made for Western Auto. And as we've seen, some of them aren't branded for any company. But if you run across one, don't be afraid. They're nice stoves. Build quality is excellent. It'll suit your purposes just as well as a Coleman will. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you next time.